This is a Miraculous Ladybug story called Duet. Marinette was having a bad day. It wasn't an unlucky day by any means. It was simply a day she desperately wished she had stayed in bed for. For one thing, she was exhausted from a long night of chasing an Akuma, and for another, she hadn't completed her homework. Her mom had fussed at her as she was leaving because she looked so worn out, and only Tiki's presence had persuaded her to get out the door a second time that day after lunch. Marinette sighed, allowing her head to lay on the desk, happy for the first time that day that school was almost over. Isla glanced at her, a bit worried for her friend. "Come on, girl, cheer up. Adrien will be here tomorrow. Nino told me," Isla whispered, keeping her voice low so the teacher couldn't hear her. Marinette almost choked as she realized that Isla thought she was so down because Adrien wasn't there. Marinette knew that she was just trying to help. Isla was always just trying to help. In fact, earlier, at lunch, Isla had saved her from getting a bad score by letting her copy the part of the homework she hadn't done. It was no secret between them that Marinette really liked Adrien, and while she had been bummed that he wasn't in school, it wasn't the sole reason for her sour mood. Despite her normally cheery attitude and penchant for clumsiness around certain people, she was only human. Wasn't she allowed to have a bad day? Frustration mingled with her exhaustion, and a strangled noise slipped from her throat, causing the teacher to turn around. "Is there an issue?" she asked. Marinette shoved herself to her feet, her face turning a bright red color. "Something stuck in my throat?" she managed to squeak, before grabbing her bag and running out the door. Marinette shook her head as she made her way to the bathroom, her exhaustion pulling at her. The bell was going to ring soon, and although she could head home early, Marinette found that she didn't want to face the cheeriness of her own home, or her parents. She had a few options, of course. She could turn into Ladybug and go hang out on the rooftops, but she knew if she did that, Chat would find her. He always found her so soon after transforming. It was like the cat had a secret Ladybug radar built in or something. A sigh escaped her, and she realized that it wouldn't be a good idea to run into him feeling the way she did. Just because she was in a bad mood didn't mean she had to spread it to others. "Marinette, are you okay?" Tiki asked, her tiny voice muffled from the closed purse. "I'm just tired and grumpy. I'll be all right, I think," Marinette answered, walking across the courtyard to an empty classroom, where she knew she could lay low as the school emptied out. The moment the door closed behind her, the bell rang, releasing a wave of happy students until the following day. A text came through on her phone a minute later from Isla, asking where she had gotten off to, and Marinette groaned, sliding down the door to the floor. Swiftly, she texted her friend back, telling her that she had decided to go home and try to get some sleep. It was a flimsy excuse, but one Isla blot immediately, and she texted back a smiley face with the words "feel better" next to it. A smile crossed Marinette's lips, the second smile to do so that day, and Tiki flew out of her purse to gently nuzzle against her neck. "I'm sorry you're having a bad day," Tiki said, flying into Marinette's cupped hands. Marinette chuckled. "It happens, Tiki, sometimes. I'll be better tomorrow, I promise." They sat there in comforting silence for a few minutes, listening to the people talking, yelling, and laughing just outside the door. Eventually, all sound faded, and Marinette slowly got to her feet, while Tiki flew from her cupped hands back into her purse to eat some of the cookies she had stored there. Wandering around the desks and chairs, Marinette moved to stand by the weak beams of sunlight that were filtering through the clouds and the leaves outside. Leaning back against one of the desks nearest the windows, she let her eyes close and head tilt back as she began to hum. Singing had always made her feel better. She didn't do it in front of people. In fact, not even Isla knew that she could sing. It helped her release some of the tension she had been feeling, and she found her slowly shaking off the strange melancholy that had kept her irritable most of the day. Her voice grew stronger as the annoyance and tiredness faded, her body relaxing as she soaked in the warmth of the afternoon sun. Adrien hated missing school for his father's business. He put up with it, of course, with a smile and perfect posture that gave no hint for the utter distaste he had for the whole thing. He despised missing a whole day of school, though. He missed his friends and the joy that they brought to his life. Adrien knew that school had ended almost half an hour ago, and he knew that it was a long shot, but he decided to drop by on his way home under the pretext of collecting homework. In reality, he wanted to see if Nina was still at school working on a project or something. Texting him would have been the easiest thing to do, but unfortunately he had left his phone at home that day. So, after convincing the gorilla he could in fact walk home alone, Adrien wandered into the empty school. He found one of his teachers who was happy to pass along his missed assignments, and unable to find anyone else, he had begun to leave. "What's that sound?" a muffled voice asked from his pocket. Adrien lifted his shirt slightly to see Plag tilting his little head to the side, his eyes closed as he listened to something. "It's pretty." Confused, Adrien looked around him. He was alone in the courtyard, and he couldn't see, much less hear anything. "What's pretty? I don't hear anything." The Kwami waved a paw at him. "Listen harder," he said rather unhelpfully. Shrugging, Adrien closed his eyes and went still, as he reached out with his other senses. At first, silence reigned, with the background noise of the street trumping everything else. Then, as individual noises separated, he could hear someone singing? He realized that it was Plag's influence that was allowing him to hear the voice, but he didn't care, because as Plag said, the voice was pretty. Eyes still closed, Adrien moved forward to the voice, eventually coming up to a door on the opposite side of the courtyard. There was a side door to the empty classroom, and he slipped inside quietly as a cat on the hunt. What he saw knocked the air from his lungs and practically made his heart stop. She leaned against the desk outlined in the red sunset, her head tilted back and a look of such peace on her face that for a moment all he could see before him was Ladybug. He was awestruck, and in a snap decision recognizing the song she sang, joined in, his voice rising to meet hers. Marinette hadn't heard the door open and close behind her, nor did she hear Adrien's soft footsteps or his gasp of surprise. What she did hear was the strong, clear male voice that rose to join hers in the song she was singing. She jolted upright, her voice losing its rhythm for a moment, but then she continued, unwilling to turn around to see who had joined her to make it a duet. Her mom had always taught her to finish the things she had started, and now she was glad that she did. Their voices rose in strength, twining around each other to become a single sound. Complementing each other wonderfully, their voices filled the small classroom with the warmth of joyful music. It came to an end all too soon, their voices dying off in echoes that seemed to fade far too quickly. Halfway through the last stanza, Marinette had finally recognized the voice that had joined hers, and now that the song was done, she felt far too flustered to even try turning around. "You have a beautiful voice, Marinette," Adrien whispered. A warm chill ran through her, and a sun-drenched Marinette turned to face him. He was standing mostly in the shadows, although 2 beams of sunlight from the upper windows cut across his hair and his eyes. They seemed to glow in the darkness, and Marinette couldn't help think about her crazy cat partner, if only just for a moment. It helped to think of him, though, because it allowed her to say, "Thank you," without a single stutter. She could still feel herself blushing as he continued to stare at her, and after a moment she managed to get out, "I really liked your voice, too. You're beautiful. I mean—" Her voice trailed off in a stutter, and embarrassment took her over again, and Adrien smiled at her from the darkness. There was the Marinette that he knew so well. He wanted to ask her why she was here so late, why she was singing alone in an empty classroom. He wanted to talk to her, to get to know her, Adrien realized with sudden shock. His heart belonged to Ladybug, it was true, but that duet had showed him that a large part of him yearned for Marinette. She was shy, though. Even now, standing in the red sunset, she was stuttering, trying to speak, seemingly unable to get a coherent sentence out. A very chat-like grin slipped across his features, and he took a breath before starting to sing once again. Marinette's head jerked up, her eyes going wide. Adrien simply raised an eyebrow and questioned, and he was overjoyed when her voice slowly rose to join his again in harmony. It was a bit squeaky and jumpy at first, but then it settled out into a harmonious flow that filled the silent space between them. Her eyes closed the moment she had answered his voice, and he took the opportunity to move closer to her, covering the short distance with soft footsteps. He came around the desk, his back to the door, facing the windows. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, although his steady voice showed no hint of it, and he allowed his hand to drop to the desk, 3 of his fingers lightly touching her hand. Marinette startled again, her voice jumping, as she looked up at him, realizing just how close he really was. Adrien didn't dare look at her, worried that if he did, she would stop singing and run away. To his relief, she stayed, her face as red as Ladybug's costume, as her voice evened out once more. They finished the second song, and Adrien finally looked over at her, overtaken with curiosity. He wanted to sing with her again, sing and sing until the stars came out, but he could tell that for the moment this was all she could handle. The magic of the moment was fading with the sunlight, and although this was the warmest, most wonderful moment he'd had in a long time, Adrien recognized that to push Marinette any farther wouldn't do him or her any good. He was a cat, though, and like all cats, he knew how to be patient. "Meet me here tomorrow after school?" he asked, and Marinette looked up at him, wide-eyed and stunning in the red sunset. "Oh, okay," she managed. Adrien, in a very cat-like boost of confidence, reached out and squeezed her hand gently, feeling his face heat up as hers did. Then, on silent feet once more, he slipped from the classroom, elated that tomorrow he could get to hear her voice once more. The moment the door closed, Marinette collapsed to the ground, her face a mad blush, and the hand that he had squeezed clutched tight to her chest. "Oh my gosh," she whispered, her heart pounding so hard that it hurt. Tiki flew from her purse to eye her charge, and couldn't help but giggle. "Well, I've told you a few times that your voice is really stunning. I'm not surprised he would want to sing with you again." Marinette reached up to hold onto the desk so she could pull her shaky body up off the floor. Adrien had sang a duet with her, and he wanted to sing with her again. Those thoughts somehow carried her out the door and home, where she collapsed on her bed, all thoughts of sleep gone from her mind. As some of her shock wore off, elation took its place, and she managed to get up to do her homework, humming the entire time. The next day passed in a delirious warm blur that not even Isla's pestering could crack. She begged off hanging out after school, and once she was sure that she was alone, Marinette snuck into the classroom. Adrien was already there, standing before the windows, and he grinned at her as she froze like a mouse before a cat. Slowly, he held out his hand for her to take. "I don't bite, you know," he said, his voice like silk as it traveled across the room. A blush spread across Marinette's face, and she managed to nod, still frozen by the door. The floor drew her eyes as she mentally shouted at herself to move forward. She didn't hear him approach, but she did notice when suddenly one hand was lifting her face so that he could look into her eyes. There was a gentle kindness in his eyes, a look of understanding that made her heart beat wildly. "You ready?" he asked. Marinette took a deep breath, and to both of their surprise her voice came out clear and strong as she answered, "Yes." A grin slid onto his face, and a smile lifted her lips as well, as together, in the sun-drenched classroom, they sang a duet.